When the keeper, hurrying up the field, was within 20 yards of the wood's edge, the otter left the chain she had been breaking her teeth on and ran away. The retriever rushed at the cub to worry it, but the ferocity of the unfamiliar beast made it hesitate. The otter remained standing by her cub, even when the keeper was pushing through the undergrowth. Thinking that a fox or badger was in the gin, he went forward to kill it with a blow of the holly staff he carried. He was peering forward when the retriever, a young animal, ran to him snarling. Something flung itself violently against his legs. The otter weighed 15 pounds, and nearly bit through the leather of his boot at the ankle. He struck at it, but hit only earth. He hurried back to the cottage for his gun, calling the retriever to heel, lest it be injured. The struggles of the cub pulled the iron peg out of the ground, and it was able to drag itself out of the ditch and slowly away among the saplings. The bitch whistled to Tarka and the other cub, who ran out from under the faggot and followed her. The mother ran on with them a little way, then returning to the cub that followed so slowly, with the gin ripping brambles and clanking against stones and roots. Behind the otters came the noise of the keeper crashing through the undergrowth, and the retriever's feet pattering near them. When the keeper came up, the cub was gasping with the weight of the iron it had dragged over 100 yards. He fired at the noise in front of him, and the noise ceased. Into the darkness of the wood he fired the second barrel, and listened. He heard stray pellets rattling in the distance, and the dragging of the gin as the retriever tried to lift it. At dawn, the crow that slept in the ivy-grown holly saw a new corpse hanging among the finches and vares, which had run into one end of a drain pipe, but never run out again. The crow said, "Ah!" and flying to the gallows tree, picked out its eyes. When daylight came, the otter and her cubs were far from the wood, having arrived at new water, deep and dark and slow-moving. Time flowed with the sunlight of the still green place. It was peaceful for the otters in the backwater, ring-rippled with the rises of fish, a waving mirror of trees and the sky, of grey doves among green ash sprays, of voles nibbling sweet roots on the banks. The otter heard every wild sound as she lay unsleeping, thinking of her lost one. The cubs breathed softly, but sometimes their nostrils worked and their legs moved, as though they were running. Late at night the bitch returned with the cubs to the wood and whistled for the lost one. She didn't know that it was dead. She knew only her longing for it. Her whistles went far into the still night as she ran with nose to the ground, stopping to whine when her grief was acute. The cock on the apple bough heard her, and crew to the dog in the kennel, who barked to its master. Hearing the bark, the otter took her cubs away, and at the end of the night, when they reached the big river, the lost cub was forgotten. Yellow from ash and elm and willow, buff from oak, rusty brown from the chestnut, scarlet from bramble, the waters bore away the first coloured leaves of the year. Beeches preserved their tawny form in rain and hail, but yielded more and more to the winds. Eels began to pass down to the sea. The eels of the two rivers were devourers of the spawn and fry of salmon and trout, and the otters were devourers of eels. Tarka stood on the shillets of the shallow stream while they twisted and moved past his legs. At first he ate a small portion of each capture near the tail, but when his hunger was gone, he picked them up, bit them, and dropped them again. Hearing the strokes of an otter's rudder, he looked in the direction of the sound and saw a strange cub with a stick in its mouth, travelling under the foamy current. Tarka followed the dim form until he reached a barrier made by an uprooted pollard willow and broken branches lodged in the stream. He climbed on the trunk, shaking water from his ears and eyes, and ran back with jubilant whistles to the sides. There he saw the cub, the stick in its mouth, standing with a grown otter. Tarka yickered and ran back to the water. The grown otter mewed to him, ran after him, licked his face, and purred in his ear. He hissed at her and whistled to his mother, who came to him, but did not drive the stranger or the cub away. The stranger had been the mother of many litters long before Tarka's mother had been born. Her fur was grizzled on pate and shoulders, and her muzzle was grey. Her canine teeth were long and yellow, and she had lost 3 of her incisors. She knew every river and stream that flowed north into the Severn Sea. She had roamed the high, cold moors of 3 counties, and had been hunted by 4 packs of otter-hounds. Her name was Grey Muzzle. She played with the otters at the slide, and remained with them when the low clouds became rosy in the east. That day all 5 hovered on Leaning Willow Island, and she curled beside Tarka and washed his fur, treating his as though he were her own cub. Then she washed the other cub, who had a white-tipped rudder. Grey Muzzle had met White-tip wandering alone 3 weeks before, and had remained with her ever since. There was friendship and sympathy between the 2 grown otters, for they never yickered or tissed at each other. Some days after the swallows had gone, Tarka heard a strange, soft, curlew-like whistle. The otters ceased their play and listened. The whistle came again, and Tarka's mother answered. The answering whistle was keen and loud. The bitch swam towards it, followed by Grey Muzzle and White-tip. The whistle made Tarka cry in rage, "Ik-yang!" And when a dog cub has cried thus, he is no more a cub, but a dog otter. The night before, the otters had fished in the estuary by the seaweedy hurdles and posts of a silted-up salmon weir, where in former times salmon were left penned by the tide. They had returned to the duck pond across fields and dikes, along an otter route, and on their trail an old dog otter had followed. Now he trailed them down to the duck pond, a big, flat-headed, full-thighed dog with great whiskers, more than double the weight of Tarka. He frightened the crier of Ik-yang, who crouched tissing with his sister, when the stranger sniffed at her nose and then licked it. This action caused Tarka's mother to behave in a curious manner. Turning fiercely on the cub, she rolled her over, bit her, and chased her under water. Many bubbles were blown up. Tarka dived to see why this strange thing had happened, but the dog turned in a swirl of water to snap at his head. Tarka was so scared that he swam to the bank and crawled out among the dry thistles. Here, while the water ran from his fur, he whistled to his mother. He saw her swimming with her head out of the water, with the strange dog behind, pretending to bite her. She was heedless of her cub's cries, and dived with the dog in play. For hours Tarka ran on the grassy bank of the duck pond, following his mother as she played in the water. Once the dog rose to the surface with a mullet in his mouth, but he didn't trouble to kill it before leaving it to float on its side. Tarka whistled again and again, and at last the big dog left the water and chased the small dog for whistling to his mate. Tarka ran away. He met White-top and Grey Muzzle, and together they returned to the duck pond when the wild fowl flighted over. Then Tarka whistled, and the dog wanted to kill him. Tarka went across the mud and the stones of the pill at his greatest speed. He cried Ik-yang several times, but if the dog had returned in answer to the challenge, it's doubtful whether Tarka would have waited to drink the blood of his enemy. Already his mother had forgotten, and perhaps would never again remember that she had loved a cub called Tarka. Tarka was alone, a young male of a ferocious and persecuted tribe. His cubhood was ended, and now indeed did his name fit his life, for he was a wanderer and homeless, with nearly every man and dog against him. He fished the pools and guts of the Branton Pill, eating what he caught among the feathery and aromatic leaves of the sea wormwood plants which grew in the mudded cracks of the sloping stone wall with the sea beet, the scentless sea lavender, and the glasswort. One night a restlessness came over him, and he rowed on the flood tide to the head of the Pill, which was not much wider than the gravel barges made fast to rusty anchors half hidden in the grass, and to bollards of rotting wood. He had been travelling for an hour, searching the overs of the bank for fish, as he had learned in cubhood, when on a sandy scour he found the pleasing scent of otter. He whistled and hurried upstream, following the scent lying wherever the seals had been pressed. Soon he heard a whistle, and a feeling of joy warmed his being. A small otter was waiting for him, sitting on a boulder, licking her coat with her tongue, the white tip of her rudder in the water. As Tarka approached, she looked at him, but she didn't move from the boulder, nor did she cease to lick her neck when he placed his forepads on the stone and looked up into her face. He mewed to her and called out of the water to stand on hind legs beside her and touch her nose. He licked her face, while his joy grew to a powerful feeling, so that when she continued to disregard him, he whimpered and struck her with one of his pads. White-tip yickered and bit him in the neck. Then she slid into the water, and with a playful sweep of her rudder, swam away from him. He followed and caught her, and they rolled in play. And to Tarka returned a feeling he had not felt since the early days in the hollow tree, when he was hungry and cold and needing his mother. He mewed like a cub to White-tip, but she ran away. He followed her into a meadow. It was strange play, it was miserable play, it was not play at all, for Tarka was an animal dispirited. He pressed her, but she yickered at him, and snapped at his neck whenever he tried to lick her face. He moved off a few yards and turned to see if she were following him. Her head was turned, she was watching. He was so thrilled that his whistle, a throat sound like the curlew's, was low and flute-like. She answered. He was in love with White-tip, and as in all wild birds and animals, his emotions were as intense as they were quick. He felt neither hunger nor fatigue, and he would have fought for her until he was weak, now that she had whistled to him. Tarka was prancing round her on a bank of gravel, when down the stream came a dog-otter with 3 white ticks on his brow, a heavy, slow-moving, coarse-haired otter, who had travelled down from the moor to find just such a mate as the one before him. Tarka cried "Ikyang" and ran at him, but the dog-otter, who weighed 30 pounds, bit him in the neck and shoulder. Tarka ran back, tissing, swinging and swaying his head before he ran forward and attacked. The older dog rolled over him and bit him several times. Tarka was so mauled that he ran away. The dog followed him, but Tarka didn't turn to fight. He was torn about the head and neck, and bitten thrice through the tongue and narrow lower jaw. He stopped at the boulder where White-tip had been sitting when first she had seen him, and listened to the whistles of his enemy. The water sang its stone song in the dark as it flowed its course to the sea. Tarka rowed on with the tide. It took him into the estuary, where the real sea was fretting the sandbanks. He heard a whistle and answered it gladly. Grey Muzzle was fishing in the estuary and calling to White-tip. The old otter, patient in life after many sorrows and fears, caressed his bitten face and neck and licked his hurts. They hunted together and slept during the day in a drain in one of the dikes of the marsh. She became dear to Tarka and gave him fish as though he were her cub, and in the course of time she took him for her mate. Then came a north wind, which poured like liquid glass from Exmoor, and made all things distinct. It made whips of the dwarf willows, and hissed through clumps of the great sea rushes. The spines of the marram grasses scratched wildly at the rushing air, which passed over the hollows where larks and linnets crouched with puffed feathers. Like a spirit freed by the sun's ruin and levelling all things before a new creation, the wind drove grains of sand against the legs and ruffled feathers of the little birds, as though it would breathe annihilation upon them, strip their frail bones of skin and flesh, and grind them until they became again that which was before the earth's old travail. Vainly the sharp and hard points of the marram grasses drew their circles on the sand. The icicle spirit was coming, and no terrestrial power could exorcise it. Old Nog, the heron, grew so thin that he looked like a bundle of grey flags, stripped by wind and clinging to 2 reeds. His inland fishing ponds were frozen. Most of the streams ran under plates of ice, and the only food he could spear was to be found at low tide in the pools of the Sharshook Ridge, where gravel had been dug. The pans and plains of the burrows were crossed by 1,000 tracks, the prints of larks, finches, wagtails, crows and gulls, the presses of weasels, rabbits and stoats, the pads of badgers and foxes, the triple toes of herons and bitterns, like the veining leaves. Many of the smaller birds were so weak they couldn't fly, and their bodies were eaten by rats and weasels, which were eaten by the larger owls and hawks. Other otters from the two rivers came down to the estuary, some of them cubs of 10 to 12 pounds in weight, who had kept together with their mothers. Families of 3 and 4 and one of 5, a bitch and 4 cubs from the boggy moorland hill where the two rivers began in the peat, came to the duck pond along the otter path from the saltings, and finding it frozen, went down the pill and out to the coast. The ebb tide moved along the seaweedy perches, stuck in the mud to mark the fairway. A mist was rising like steam from the top of the water, which moved slower with its weight of surface slush. The slush became clotted and hardened, and suddenly ceased to move. The star points dulled. Orion was stripped of his flashing, the green tongue of Sirius was mute, the swan lost her lustre, the glare of the bull faded. The little thin cub, on its couch among the reeds, frozen and bent like the legs of dead spiders, greeted Grey Muzzle with husky mewing whenever it heard her coming, and would not be comforted by tongue caresses. Frost had stricken its eyes. Grey Muzzle prowled all day and all night when she was not warming and suckling her cub, and although she was so hungry she still played with Tarka, sliding head first down a snowy hillock. They had to travel to the estuary for food, for every incoming tide pulled up its floating floes at the pill mouth, with grinding shrieks and shuddering booms that sounded far over the burrows. At low tide the frost welded them in a high and solid barrier. Both otters had blistered their tongues by licking ice, and to ease their thirst they rasped them against snow on the sea wall in the middle of the day. Swans moved up with the tide, the otters after them. They were thin and weak. For mussels, winkles, and sometimes a sour-green crab were poor nourishment for an otter who, in careless times, had eaten a 3-pound sea trout at a sitting, and been hungry 2 hours afterwards. The swans turned north, borne by the tide racing past Crow Island. The otters drifted nearer, only their wide nostrils above water. When they were 10 yards away from the nearest swan, the nostrils sank, and chains of bubbles rose unseen above them. The swan saw a dark form under the water, but before it could lift out its head, Tarka had bitten onto its neck. Wind from the swan's wings scalloped the water and scattered the spray, and one struck Tarka a blow that made him float slowly away. But Grey Muzzle hung to the swan's foot, even when her rudder was nearly out of the water as she was dragged along. The swan trumpeted afar its anger and fear. Across the pull of the tide among the grating ice floes, the otters took the swan, whose flappings were getting feeble as the death fear grew less. Tarka had bitten the artery in the neck. When the otters rested, the bird lay quiet on the water. It heard the wings of its brethren beating out the flying song of swans, hompa, 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 high and remote in the night. It flapped thrice and died. Tarka and Grey Muzzle swam with the swan to the shore, where they bit into the throat and closed their eyes as they drank its hot blood. Later, Grey Muzzle returned to the duck pond and her cub. Unsteadily it dragged its little body towards her and opened its mouth to greet her. No sound came from its mouth. Its legs trembled and couldn't carry its head, which hung over the couch of reeds. Its paws were frostbitten, its eye sockets empty. Grey Muzzle stared at it before lying down and giving the shelter of her body. She spoke to it and took it in her paws and licked its face, which was her only way of telling her love. The cub tottered away and sought the milk which it could not find. Afterwards it slept until she left again to seek food in the wide daylight, following the slot of deer across snow. The ice talons set harder in the land. No twitter of finch or linnet was heard on the burrows, for those which remained were dead. Vainly the linnets had sought the seeds locked in the plants of the glasswort. Even crows died of starvation. There were no stars that night, for clouds lowered in the sky. As Grey Muzzle walked on the ice upstream, snow began to fall in flakes like the breast feathers of swans. Grey Muzzle walked under the bridge and, smelling the ducks, climbed up the bank. As she was walking past the beehives, she heard a sound that made her stop and gasp, the ick-clang of a sprung gin. Tarka was rolling and twisting and jerking the heavy gin and chain off the ground. It held him. He lay still, his heart throbbing, blowing and tissing and slavering. The sight closed Grey Muzzle's nostrils so that she breathed through her open mouth. She called to him. The gin clanked, the chain clinked. She ran round him until Tarka's leaps that wrenched the sinews of his leg ceased in weakness, and he sank across the long rusty spring, blowing bubbles of blood out of his nostrils. Grey Muzzle rasped the bone of the trapped paw with the sharp stumps of her broken teeth. A rat passed near, brought by the smell of blood. It fled when it saw whose blood was wasting. Grey Muzzle's face was torn, but Tarka didn't know that he had bitten her. She bit through the sinews, which were strong and thick, and Tarka was free. He rushed to the river. Grey Muzzle remained, remembering her cub. In a nearby farmyard, a dog in its kennel was barking loudly. There was an answering shout in the house that set the animal jumping against its chain. Both Grey Muzzle and Tarka knew the sequence of barking dog and the shout of a man in a house. Grey Muzzle stayed until the farm door opened, and then she ran away. When the farmer came to the shed with his gun and lantern, he found his gin sprung and 3 toes of a paw lying in a red spatter about it. Seeing dots of blood leading away over the snow, he hurried to the cottage of one of his labourers and knocked on the door. He shouted, "I've got 'em," as his father had shouted in the church door during a sermon half a century before, calling the men to leave and pursue the tracks of a fox through the snow. The collie dog found the otters for them in a shed where Tarka had crawled for a refuge. Tarka stood back in a corner on a heap of artificial manure sacks, while Grey Muzzle ran at the dog, tissing and snapping her broken teeth. The lantern light made of her eyes 2 tawny orbs of menace. Tarka found a hole in the wall, while Grey Muzzle fought the collie. Weakened by starvation, she was not able to fight for long, and as the farmer said afterwards, it was not even necessary to waste a cartridge, when a dung fork could pin her down, and a ferreting bar break her head. They carried the body back to the farm, where the farmer drew a pint of ale for each of his helpers from the barrel in the cellar. While they were drinking, the collie dog began to bark, and as it would not stop after several cries of "Shut that rattle, you!" the farmer went out and gave it a kick in the ribs. He forbore to say how noisy his dog had been afterwards, deeming this a point not in its favour. For how was he, his natural senses dulled by civilization, to have known that an otter had remained all night in the farmyard, waiting for the mate that never came? Tarka was gone, in the mist and rain of the day, to hide among the reeds of the marsh pond, the sere and icicled reeds, which now could sink to their ancestral ooze and sleep, perchance to dream of sun-stored summers, raising the green stems, of wind-shaken anthers dropping gold pollen over June's young maces, of seeds shaped and clasped and taught by the brown autumn mother. The south wind was breaking from the great roots the talons of the icicle spirit, and freeing 10,000 flying seeds in each brown head. Water covered the pond ice, deep enough to sail a feather, and at night every hoof-hole held its star. Bogs and hummocks of the great knee-set were dimmed and occluded. The hill was higher than the clouds. In drifts and hollows of silence the vapour passed, moving with the muffled wind over water plashes, colourless in reflection. Sometimes a colder waft brought the sound of slow trickling. Here in the fen 5 rivers began, in peat darker than the otter which had followed the Torridge to its source. Tarka climbed up one of the humps of grey club moss and trod in its centre a bed, soft and warm, yet cool for the paw thrust among the long, tight-growing fronds. The moss grew on and over a bush of heather, whose springy stems yielded to his curled body. He had travelled from the estuary, sleeping by day in riverside holts and marches, and feeding at night, remembering nothing because the moor was unfamiliar to his nose and ears and eyes. When his paw ached, he licked it. It had been a happy journey up the river, swollen with snow water, hunting fish and playing with sticks and stones, while mating owls called through the darkness of valleys. The brimming light gladdened Tarka, and he rolled for several minutes, playing with a shiny ball he found in the grass, the old dropping of a wild pony. Afterwards, running down to the water, he found a holt under a rock. It was cold and wet inside, and Tarka always slept dry when he could. He ran out again, liking the sun, and settled on a flat rock in the warming rays. Tarka gave chase to a rabbit during the next night, bolting it from a hillside clitter of rocks in a hollow at the head of a cleave. Near the clitter, a tall stone reared head, shoulders, and body above the rocks embedded there, in the outline of a sea lion, smooth and curved. The rabbit ran as far as a hole in the northwestern base of the stone sea lion, but turned in terror as it smelt the dreaded smell of a fitch or stoat. The rabbit's wits went from it in a thin squealing. Its will to run away was gripped in the base of its spine by a feeling of sickly fascination. Its squeals caused an exciting chattering near it, and almost immediately the fitch had it by the side of the neck and was dragging it into the hole. The fitch, whose name was Swagdagger, was about to kill it when Tarka ran through the opening. Swagdagger loosened his bite to threaten the strange big invader, flicking his black-tipped tail and glaring at Tarka. One kick of the rabbit's hind legs, so powerful for running, would have broken Swagdagger's neck, but it crouched still, its nervous force oozing away. Tarka ran at it. Swagdagger faced him with an angry chaka and was nipped in the shoulder. The fitch ran out through the opening, but turned outside and gibbered in fury. Tarka looked once at the green points that were the fitch's eyes and went on with his work. Swagdagger went away to climb a granite stone and chaka into the night. The moon was rising, dim in the mist, and the harsh notes echoed about the grey stillness of the granite clitter. Ka, 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 he rattled, throwing his call one way, then another. He was summoning the stoats of Belston Cleave. Tarka had eaten half the rabbit when a strong scent made him look round again. He saw in the low opening several greenish dots that stared and swung about and stared again. He went on eating. Delicate sniffs, sudden rustles and paddings, scratchings, a quick sneeze. He peered for another way out, wanting to be alone. He found a crack and explored it with his nose before beginning to scrape. He sucked in the scent of fitch, for Swagdagger's mate had her nest of young beyond the crack. She had been hunting a rabbit 300 yards away when Swagdagger had climbed the stone, and as soon as she heard the call, she galloped back. Other fitches had run to the summons of Swagdagger. Sharp-toothed, bloodthirsty, and without fear, they ran up and down by the opening, sniffing the delicious scent of fresh-slain rabbit, weaving quick bodies and lifting their small heads to sniff, sniff, sniff. The noises of teeth at work made a furious stir in the assembling tribe. The older dogfitch yakkered with rage as he wove in and out of the swift and impatient throng. The little angry fitches in the cranny, beyond the nose of Tarka, heard the cry of their mother and spat at the enemy. All moving things unknown were enemies to the little fitches. She ran through the fitches outside in the moonlight and into the cave, jumping in her twisty way for a bite behind the otter's ear. Tarka shook her and tried to kill her, but she ran at him again, and with her ran Swagdagger and all the fitches who had come to his alarm. Tarka trod on stoats. He was pricked all over by the teeth of stoats. He chopped one through the ribs and back, but its biting didn't cease. He chopped it again, trying to hold it by his forepaws, but though broken it was alive and angry and bit through the skin of his throat and hung there as long as his rudder. He pushed through fitches into the moonlight, and the fitches followed him, including the 4 young ones, who were excited and eager for play. The pack chased him, throwing their sharp tongues all the rugged way down to the river, into which Tarka jumped with a splash. 3 of them fell in after him, but they didn't like the water and crawled out, spitting and sneezing, tough and lithe and sinuous as binds of honeysuckle. Unable to find the otter, the dogfitches started a fight among themselves. As Swagdagger's mate went up the hill again with her young running behind her, she met a badger who was going to drink in the river. Out of the way. He sought no unnecessary trouble with fishes. He had eaten up the rabbit under the seal stone.